The wind howls across the steppe, cold and endless, carrying the scent of smoke, sweat, and iron. Imagine a circle of warriors kneeling beneath a bruised sky, their breath thick in the air. At the center lies a bowl not of gold nor silver, but clay chipped and darkened by fire. Into it each man presses his blade into his own flesh, letting crimson drops fall like rain into the vessel. They do not flinch. To flinch would be to falter. To falter would be to die. This was not a ritual of comfort. It was a pact with shadows. The oath of loyalty to Genghis Khan was not sealed with mere promises, but with blood itself. And if you found yourself among them, blade in hand, the bitter taste of iron waiting on your lips, you probably wouldn't survive this initiation. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. The Mongol steppe was not kind to the weak, nor forgiving to the unfaithful. Genghis Khan understood that loyalty could not be begged or bought. It had to be torn from the soul, reforged in the furnace of fear and brotherhood. His empire, one that would stretch farther and faster than any before it, was not held together by sheer might alone, but by these blood oaths that stitched warriors into a single living organism. They called it Anda, brotherhood deeper than kinship, sharper than steel. Yet this was no gentle fraternity. The truth was more chilling. To share blood with another meant that your body, your spirit, even your ancestors were no longer yours alone. You were bound to your brothers, bound to your Khan, bound to an idea that thrived on conquest and death. Break that bond, and punishment was not just execution. It was annihilation of your honor, your family, even your memory. Some chroniclers whispered of oath-breakers buried alive, their bodies pressed under earth as if the steppe itself rejected them. Others were cut down publicly, their blood staining the same soil that had once drunk their vows. What made these rituals truly terrifying was their secrecy. They weren't grand spectacles for the whole tribe to see, but half-hidden ceremonies lit by firelight, whispered across by wind, and witnessed only by those chosen. This secrecy made them more binding, for you never truly knew what others had pledged alongside you. And perhaps that was the point, you could never be certain of where your oath ended and where another man's began. One well-recorded fact remains undeniable. Genghis Khan himself rose to power not only by force, but through carefully chosen alliances sealed with blood pacts. His most trusted generals, Subutai Jebe and others, were not just soldiers. They were blood-bound, as inseparable from his destiny as his own shadow. That is the accepted truth of history. His empire rested on the ritual of loyalty. But there are disturbing fragments of detail buried in the chronicles. Some sources describe how warriors were sometimes forced to mingle their blood with horses' milk or even with the ashes of burnt offerings, drinking a concoction that turned an oath into something almost supernatural. The taste, they said, was foul enough to make even the hardened gag, but refusal meant death. You can imagine the pressure. Gag and maybe your comrades laughed. Refuse and perhaps your corpse fed the ravens by dawn. And yet, historians still argue whether these oaths were as widespread and brutal as the legends insist. Were all warriors forced to drink from the bowl? Or were such rituals reserved for the elite, the inner circle who guarded the Khan's life? Some scholars claim that the accounts may have been exaggerated by later writers to heighten the aura of Mongol cruelty, turning symbolic gestures into lurid tales. Others counter that the sheer terror left in the memory of conquered peoples could not have been conjured from nothing. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Rituals that were performed selectively, strategically, meant to cement loyalty where ordinary promises would break. Yet no matter the scale, the legend of these blood oaths spread like wildfire, seeping into the imagination of both Mongols and their enemies. The steppe winds carried whispers of it, until the very word Mongol became inseparable from images of blades, blood, and bonds stronger than family. So when the bowl passed to you in that circle, and the eyes of your brothers bore into yours, what would you do? Refuse and risk your skull split open before the fire. Drink and forever lose the right to call your life your own. Some choices, it seems, were no choices at all. Above the endless plains, the Mongols raised their eyes to the eternal blue sky. For them, it was not just weather or backdrop, it was the living presence of Tingri, the sky god, who saw everything. Imagine the weight of swearing an oath when you believed the heavens themselves were peering down, judging every cut of your blade and every drop of your blood. The winds that tore across the grasslands carried more than dust. They carried the whispers of ancestors, wolves, and spirits. In such a world, loyalty was never just political. It was sacred. The Mongols claimed descent from a union between a blue-gray wolf and a doe, creatures of the wilderness whose children were destined to roam and rule. This myth was not a bedtime story but a compass for their identity. To invoke the wolf in a ritual meant summoning ferocity, cunning, and the promise that betrayal would be hunted down with the same merciless hunger. The blue sky, infinite and watchful, was invoked alongside it. Together, wolf and sky framed the backdrop of blood oaths. Swearing before them was not simply a promise. It was tethering your soul to a cosmic order that would not easily forgive broken words. One historical fact stands firm. Genghis Khan consistently tied his authority to divine favor. Chroniclers recorded how he claimed to rule by the will of the eternal blue sky, presenting himself not just as a warlord but as the chosen instrument of a god. His warriors believed, or at least feared enough to act as though they believed, that breaking an oath to him was the same as insulting Tingri. To the Mongol mind, that was not just risky, it was suicidal. And here's the disturbing twist that most people overlook. Some oaths involved invoking wolves in ways far more literal than myth. There are scattered accounts of rituals where wolf blood was mixed with that of warriors, or where wolf skins were draped over shoulders during ceremonies, a reminder that their bond was animalistic and primal. To wear the skin was to borrow the wolf's hunger, but also to accept its curse. If you betrayed your oath, it wasn't just your comrades who would hunt you, it was the wolf spirit itself, prowling the darkness. Was this widespread practice? Or were these isolated moments that became exaggerated in the retelling? Historians cannot quite agree. In fact, historians argue endlessly about how much of these wolf and sky invocations were deeply held beliefs versus political theater. Did Genghis himself truly believe he was chosen by Tingri? Or was this a clever narrative to legitimize his empire to superstitious tribes, weaving together faith and fear into a single unbreakable thread? Some scholars suggest he may have been pragmatic, using whatever mythology would bind people to him. Others insist his consistency and the deep integration of sky worship into Mongol culture point to sincere conviction. The uncertainty lingers like smoke after a battle. Impossible to grasp, impossible to ignore. Picture it, a warrior standing beneath the open heavens, a fresh cut dripping into the ritual bowl, wolf hides swaying in the night wind, and all around brothers chanting words that blur between prayer and threat. How small would you feel in that moment? With every heartbeat, the wolf inside you howls, the sky above you stares, and you realize you are trapped between earth and eternity. And yet, in the shadows, irony crept in. For all their sacred seriousness, Mongols had a knack for mixing brutality with practicality. One story tells of warriors finishing a blood oath, then immediately reaching for fermented mare's milk to wash down the taste, because even eternal loyalty tastes better with a chaser. Another tale whispers of an oath-taking interrupted by a wolf wandering into camp, which the men interpreted as an omen. Some saw it as blessing, others as warning. You can almost hear the awkward silence. Do we keep cutting ourselves or run? Still, the myth of the wolf and the eternal sky endured. It gave weight to their rituals, flavor to their loyalty, and terror to their betrayals. Remember that circle of warriors in the firelight from before? Now add the unseen presence of divine eyes above and a wolf's gaze at your back. Suddenly, breaking that blood oath no longer meant just angering your Khan. It meant spitting in the face of gods and beasts alike, a choice few would dare make. The story of Genghis Khan's blood oaths does not begin with grand armies or sprawling empires, but with boys in the dust of the steppe, binding themselves with childish promises that would later calcify into unbreakable chains. In the harsh world of nomadic tribes, childhood was short and play was always laced with survival. Even then, the young Temujin, before he became Genghis Khan, learned that promises meant life or death. A broken word could leave you abandoned in the wilderness, and on the Mongol steppe, abandonment was simply another way of spelling execution. Among his earliest bonds was his pact with Jamukha, the childhood friend who would one day become both blood brother and bitter enemy. They swore Anda, a word deeper than friendship, closer than kinship, an oath that said, I am you and you are me. To seal it, they shared their belongings, hunted side by side, and cut their palms so that blood might mingle, children imitating the rituals of men. It was this kind of brotherhood that Temujin carried into adulthood, transforming personal loyalty into the bedrock of an empire. One indisputable historical fact remains. The concept of Anda was ancient among the Mongols, long before Genghis rose to power. But under him it became weaponized. What had once been a pact between equals grew into a ritual where the Khan was always greater, his brothers forever bound beneath his shadow. The intimacy of childhood pacts turned into political contracts written in flesh. Yet in these bonds lurked disturbing possibilities. Imagine being sworn as Anda and later commanded to kill your own family because loyalty to the Khan outweighed blood ties. There are accounts suggesting that oath brothers were sometimes placed in impossible situations, forced to prove their loyalty by severing ties with their past. Some stories even whisper that oath brothers were required to share wives or wealth to demonstrate that nothing, no person, no treasure, stood above their unity. To modern ears, it sounds grotesque. But in their world, it was simply proof that your Anda bond mattered more than your own heart. The tension between love and loyalty rippled through Temujin's life. When he and Jamukha eventually clashed, their bond became a curse. Each had sworn brotherhood, each had shared blood, but ambition could not be contained by oaths. When Jamukha broke from him, gathering thousands to oppose him, Temujin called upon his blood brothers to stand firm. The war that followed was not just a tribal feud, it was a civil war between oaths. And when Temujin triumphed, his punishment was merciless. He is said to have boiled 70 of Jamukha's men alive, a warning carved in steam and screams, "Break brotherhood and your death will be worse than dishonor." Yet historians still argue whether the severity of this episode is truth or embellishment. Some chronicles insist the 70 victims were indeed boiled in giant cauldrons as a spectacle of terror. Others suggest it may have been metaphorical, a phrase twisted into literal horror by later retellings. Was it real? Was it a story designed to make even the memory of betrayal unbearable? We cannot be certain. What we do know is that Jamukha's fall cemented Temujin's reputation. His bonds of loyalty were sacred, but betrayal would ignite consequences no mortal could endure. You can imagine being a young warrior drawn into his orbit, recalling the games you once played as a child, pacts sealed with spit or twine, and realizing those same rituals now carried the weight of life, death, and empire. Would you hesitate to press your blade into your palm, knowing that the cut would never heal, not truly? Or would you laugh nervously the way some men did, muttering, "Well, at least it's not boiling water this time," before pressing your hand to the bowl? There is a cruel irony here. What started as childhood gestures of trust, sharing food, sharing blood, sharing words, became the machinery of domination. Genghis Khan knew that if children could be bound by play, men could be shackled by ritual. And so the brotherhood of his youth became the empire of his future. Every oath was personal, but every oath was also political, tightening the net around the steppe until even freeborn warriors found themselves caught. So when men gathered to swear before him, they were not just swearing to Genghis Khan the man, but to Temujin the boy who had once believed in the purity of brotherhood. Perhaps that is why his oaths cut so deep. He still carried the memory of promises made long ago, and he knew that once blood was shared, nothing, not even friendship, was safe from its grip. The fire burned low, its smoke curling upward like a black ribbon, stinging the eyes of men who refused to blink. At the center of the circle stood the bowl, the infamous vessel of blood. It was never beautiful. Most times it was crude, clay or wood, sometimes a battered copper basin dented from years of use. Yet what it contained mattered more than any golden chalice, the mingled lifeblood of warriors who had cut themselves open for loyalty. One by one, they pressed their palms or arms with sharpened blades, letting their blood drip into the vessel. The liquid darkened, thickened, until it was no longer one man's blood but all men's. This was no ritual for the squeamish. When the bowl was raised, every warrior drank from it, sealing an oath so intimate it was impossible to undo. Here is the historical fact. Sources such as the Secret History of the Mongols and later chroniclers describe these blood-mingling rites as a cornerstone of Mongol brotherhood. It was not unique to them. Many steppe cultures practiced similar rites, but under Genghis Khan the ritual was elevated to an imperial glue, something that turned scattered tribes into one body. The act of drinking blood was not symbolic. It was believed to literally make the lifeblood of one man flow in another. By drinking, you ceased to be an individual. You became part of the collective organism that was bound to the Khan. And yet, there are disturbing little details buried in whispers. Some accounts describe warriors gagging at the taste of the blood and trying to mask it with fermented mare's milk, or mixing in herbs to disguise the iron sting. Other stories hint at darker variations. Blood was sometimes combined with ashes of burnt animal bones, or even mixed with urine as a test of absolute submission. Such accounts may sound like grotesque exaggerations, but they cling stubbornly to the historical record. Were they real, or were enemies of the Mongols eager to make their rituals seem more barbaric? Historians still cannot agree. The uncertainty deepens when we ask, who actually drank from the bowl? Was it every warrior in the Khan's service, or only his inner circle, the elite oath brothers upon whom he relied most heavily? Some scholars suggest that the bowl of blood was not a mass ritual at all, but a tightly controlled ceremony, perhaps performed once in a man's life. Others argue that these ceremonies were repeated at key moments, before great battles, after victories, or when traitors were discovered, as a grim reminder of what betrayal meant. Picture the scene. You stand in that circle, sweat dripping down your back even as the cold air nips at your skin. The bowl is passed into your hands, heavy and sticky. You raise it, and the blood catches the firelight, reflecting your face in warped crimson. Around you, every pair of eyes waits. You take a sip. It is warm, metallic, unbearable. Your stomach lurches, but you swallow because to spit would be worse than death. You hand the bowl onward, and in that moment you are no longer you. You are one of them. And irony finds its way even here. Mongol humor, as grim as their steppe winters, often bled into these moments. Some men would joke, "At least this is fresher than the mare's milk," or quip that if the blood came from a particularly scrappy warrior, they hoped it didn't sour the taste. Dark laughter rippled through such gatherings, because humor was the only shield left when drinking the essence of your comrades. Still, beneath the jokes, the bowl remained a terrifying anchor. Once you had drunk from it, there was no escape. Break the oath, and you were no longer just a traitor, you were a parasite in the body of the brotherhood, a disease to be cut out. That is why the punishment of oath breakers was so inventive and cruel. If the bowl had made you part of the whole, then the whole would destroy you in return. The bowl of blood was both sacred and sinister, communion and curse. It transformed loyalty from an idea into a taste you could never forget. You could ride away from camp, leave the firelight behind, but the memory of iron on your tongue would follow you to your grave. And perhaps that was the point. Genghis Khan wanted loyalty to linger not only in your heart but in your very mouth. Loyalty bound by blood might sound powerful, but the Mongols knew that the true strength of an oath came from the punishment that awaited those foolish enough to break it. The mere act of drinking from the bowl was terrifying, but what followed betrayal was far worse. In the Mongol imagination, an oath-breaker wasn't just disloyal, he was diseased, poisonous, and contagious. If he lived, the infection could spread. And so, every punishment for treachery carried a symbolic weight. The community would cut the rot out before it spread to the rest of the body. One well-recorded fact is this: Genghis Khan demanded absolute obedience. Accounts from the secret history of the Mongols and other chronicles describe his swift punishment of those who betrayed him. If a general disobeyed, even slightly, his punishment was not delayed until after victory. Justice, or vengeance, was immediate. For the Khan, hesitation was the soil in which betrayal grew, and he refused to let it take root. This uncompromising stance created an empire where loyalty was rewarded, but suspicion was a death sentence. Yet the disturbing details are what linger in memory. Some chronicles tell of oath-breakers being executed in ways that mocked their betrayal. One tale describes a man who drank from the blood bowl, then later plotted desertion. When he was caught, his own blood was drained into a vessel, which was then forced upon him to drink before his death. Another account whispers of warriors buried alive with their mouths stuffed full of earth, symbolizing that they had consumed the steppe in lies, and now the steppe consumed them in return. Imagine the suffocating panic of soil filling your lungs while the sky, the eternal blue sky you had sworn beneath, looked down without mercy. But historians still argue, were these punishments universal or reserved for dramatic examples to instill fear? Some scholars suggest that tales of burial and forced drinking were embellished by enemies eager to paint the Mongols as savages. Others argue that the psychological impact of such punishments was precisely the point, whether they were widespread or not. In an oral culture, rumor carried as much power as fact. Perhaps only a few men were buried alive, but if every warrior believed it could happen to them, then the oath held iron weight. Consider the irony. The same bowl that united men in loyalty could become the vessel of their humiliation. To drink was to be bound. To refuse was to die. To betray was to choke on your own false promises. And still, among the grim silence of punishment, Mongol humor crept through. One joke whispered by later storytellers claimed that oath-breakers were punished not with death but with banishment to live among sedentary farmers. A fate worse than drinking dirt, they'd say, chuckling darkly. The fear of breaking an oath was so ingrained that warriors would rather face impossible odds in battle than risk being branded a traitor. Imagine yourself as one of them. Your Khan orders a charge against an army 3 times your size. You know the odds. You know the likely outcome. But you also know the punishment for refusal. So you tighten your grip on your bow, spur your horse forward, and convince yourself that death in battle is preferable to the slow suffocation of betrayal. This is why the Mongols were feared not only for their military brilliance but for their terrifying cohesion. Every rider in the horde fought with the certainty that his brothers would not desert him, because the price of disloyalty was far worse than the risk of arrows. The oath-breaker was despised more than the enemy. And in a cruel twist of irony, loyalty enforced by terror created some of the fiercest loyalty known to history. So when the fire burned low and the bowl passed from hand to hand, each warrior knew the truth. It wasn't just what went into the bowl that mattered, but what might be taken from it if he faltered. The blood oath was a bargain with no loophole: drink now or be destroyed later. The ritual knife glinted in the firelight, its edge not meant for killing this time, but for carving loyalty into flesh. For the Mongols, blood was not conjured out of thin air. It had to be drawn with steel, cut from skin, etched into memory. And unlike a bowl that could be emptied or a promise that could fade, the wound itself lingered as a living reminder. Every time a warrior flexed his hand and felt the sting of scar tissue, he remembered the oath he had sworn. It is a historical fact that scarification and ritual cutting were common among nomadic societies, not only in Mongolia but across Central Asia. These marks were not decorative, they were declarations. The Mongols, pragmatic as always, used them to transform loyalty into something visible. The scar was proof that you had bled for the Khan, a badge no one could deny. In a culture where words could be twisted and promises forgotten, flesh was harder to dispute. Yet beneath this practicality lay disturbing detail. Some whispers say warriors were not always allowed to make the cut themselves. Instead, another man, often the one to whom you were swearing loyalty, would cut you, ensuring that the pain and scar came from his hand. Imagine the psychological weight of that, your body branded not by your own choice but by the will of your Khan or comrade. The wound was not just yours, it was theirs, inscribed on your flesh as both mark and reminder. And here lies the uncertainty. Historians disagree on whether such practices were widespread or symbolic. Some argue that references to cutting bonds in chronicles are metaphorical, describing the act of forming ties, not literally slicing skin. Others insist the physical scars were real, citing descriptions of warriors comparing old ritual wounds and moments of camaraderie. Did every Mongol bear such marks, or was this reserved for those closest to power? The answer is lost in the haze of history. Picture yourself in that circle again. You extend your hand, palm upward. A blade hovers, then bites. Warm blood wells, stinging as the air bites into the cut. You flinch instinctively and laughter erupts from your comrades. You'll bleed more from the saddle sores tomorrow, one jokes, half to mock, half to ease the sting. The humor is dark, but necessary because without it the ritual would crush you with its weight. The scars did more than remind men of their oath, they were warnings to others. If you bore the mark of loyalty, betrayal became doubly damning. Not only had you broken a word, you had desecrated your own body. And the Mongols were not forgiving of those who carried dishonor visibly on their skin. Rumors tell of oath breakers whose scars were deliberately reopened in public before execution, as though erasing the bond they had so shamefully shattered. Whether truth or exaggeration, the idea of it was enough to haunt the imagination. Ironically, some men wore their scars proudly, boasting of them like trophies. They joked that while horses could be branded with fire, Mongol warriors carried their brands in blood. Others quipped that the scars were useful for bartering with women. See this mark? It proves I'm loyal, at least until the next bowl comes around. Such dark levity masked the fact that the cuts were not optional, not playful. They were binding in ways laughter could not undo. The cutting of flesh turned loyalty into something that could not be undone. A spoken promise could fade into the air, but a scar remained stubbornly visible, even years later, long after the man who had made it was dust. Genghis Khan understood that memory needed anchors, and what better anchor than pain? Every scar was a line of poetry written in red, verses that told the story of submission, trust, and fear. And so, beneath the eternal sky, warriors bled willingly, carrying their oaths in their skin long after the fire burned out. The steppe was filled with echoes of those scars, silent reminders that once cut, there was no going back. The Mongol rituals of loyalty did not end with blood alone. Flesh was cut, blood was mingled, yes, but the steppe demanded more elaborate gestures to please both men and spirits. Fire crackled as bones were burned, their smoke drifting upward as an offering. Cups of kumis, fermented mare's milk, frothy and sharp, were poured out or gulped down alongside blood, sealing oaths with a taste that was both intoxicating and nauseating. This blend of blood, fire, and milk turned ordinary vows into ceremonies that bordered on the supernatural. It is a historical fact that fire held sacred power in Mongol culture. They believed fire was a living spirit, a mediator between humans and the eternal blue sky. To swear an oath near flames or to burn offerings gave those promises cosmic legitimacy. A ritual without fire was toothless, but with fire the oath burned into eternity. But disturbing details lurk here too. Some accounts describe the burning of bones, not just animal bones but those of executed enemies, as part of these loyalty rites. Warriors would throw fragments into the fire, watching as the smoke rose skyward, believing that the spirits of the dead bore witness. Imagine swearing loyalty while the ashes of your foes drifted into your lungs, binding you not only to your Khan but to the ghosts of those he had destroyed. There are whispers that kumis was sometimes mixed with ash from these fires, then forced upon oath-takers. The taste must have been vile, but that was the point. You were drinking not only loyalty but conquest itself. Historians remain divided on whether these grisly details were routine or rare exaggerations. Was the ash truly ingested, or was it symbolic, a gesture mistaken for something literal by later chroniclers? Some scholars argue that conquered enemies' bones would never have been wasted on ritual, while others point to recurring mentions in both Persian and Chinese sources that suggest something unsettling was indeed practiced. The debate remains unresolved, a fire whose smoke still clouds the truth. Picture yourself at one of these gatherings. The fire roars, shadows dance across the faces of men scarred and stern. Into the flames go bones, cracking as they burn. The smell is acrid, sharp, unforgettable. A bowl is lifted to your lips, the mixture warm, sour, and bitter, stinging your throat as it slides down. You gag, your stomach recoils, but all eyes are on you. To falter now is to brand yourself as weak, unfit, perhaps treacherous. So you force a smile, cough, and croak out some dark humor. Tastes better than my mother-in-law's cooking. The men laugh, the tension cracks, and the ritual moves forward. The joke is survival, but the scar in your memory is permanent. The use of milk alongside blood was no accident either. Milk was life on the steppe, sustenance, purity, the nourishment of both human and horse. To mingle it with blood was to twist life and death into a single cup. Drink it and you swallowed contradiction itself. Was it blessing? Was it curse? It did not matter. The Khan demanded it, the fire sanctified it, and the steppe bore witness. Here irony seeps through again. These harsh warriors who carved empires with arrows and flame would pause in silence around a fire, carefully offering milk as though honoring fragile spirits. Then seconds later they would ride off to burn villages and slaughter foes. The contradiction was not lost on them. Some quipped that the spirits preferred the taste of milk over blood, but the Khan, well, he had a different palate. In the end, these rituals with fire and milk deepened the psychological grip of loyalty. They layered the oath with textures, the sting of cuts, the taste of blood, the burn of smoke, the sourness of kumis. Each sense was engaged, ensuring no warrior could forget what he had promised. Rituals do not need to be beautiful to be effective. Sometimes the grotesque clings harder to memory. And Genghis Khan knew well, a memory that scars every sense is one that can never be erased. The Mongols never swore their oaths in isolation. Each ritual, each cut of the blade, each bowl lifted to the lips, was done under eyes that were not always visible. To the warriors of the steppe, spirits lingered everywhere, ancestral souls watching from the smoke, the eternal blue sky gazing down from above, even the restless shades of the defeated pacing just beyond the firelight. When they bound themselves with blood, they did not only pledge before men, they pledged before a host of unseen witnesses whose judgment was far more terrifying. One historical fact stands clear. Ancestor worship and spirit veneration were deeply rooted in Mongol culture. Before riding into battle, they would pour out libations of mare's milk or whisper prayers to the spirits of their forebears. The presence of unseen witnesses made every action doubly weighted. A broken oath was not merely betrayal of a Khan, it was cosmic treason, a crime against the dead who had given life and the heavens that gave destiny. But here's the disturbing detail. Whispers suggest that, during some rituals, small offerings of blood or meat were left aside specifically for the dead. A drop of blood would be flicked into the fire or into the air, for those who watch. There are tales of warriors who claim to see shadowy figures circling just beyond the circle of flames. Whether spirits or tricks of exhaustion, who can say? The belief was enough to make the hair rise on the back of the neck. Imagine swearing an oath while convinced that your grandmother's ghost is peering disapprovingly over your shoulder. Death you might accept. Eternal shame? That was far worse. Historians remain divided on how literally these spirit witnesses should be taken. Some argue that the gestures were symbolic, part of a spiritual vocabulary woven into everyday life. Others believe that the Mongols truly feared immediate supernatural retribution. After all, Chronicles describe warriors who fell mysteriously ill after oath-taking, their comrades whispering that the spirits had punished their insincerity. Was it illness? Coincidence? Or a collective fear so powerful it killed as surely as an arrow? The truth, as always, wavers like smoke. Picture yourself in that firelit circle again. You drink from the bowl, your throat burning with blood and mare's milk, and you feel dozens of eyes on you, not only those of your comrades, but unseen gazes pressing in from the dark. The silence after the chant is heavy. The wind whistles, and for a moment you swear it carries whispers, voices of the dead asking, "Will you keep your word?" You shiver though the fire is hot. Suddenly, the oath feels larger than life, because it is. And of course, the Mongols' dark humor found its way into even this. One story tells of a warrior who, after swearing, muttered aloud to the spirits, "If you watch me, at least help me aim straight." His comrades roared with laughter, breaking the suffocating solemnity. But beneath the laughter was unease. No one wanted to joke too loudly in case the unseen audience didn't share their sense of humor. The presence of these secret witnesses magnified the power of the oath. It wasn't just that your brothers might kill you if you faltered. It was that the ancestors would abandon you, the eternal sky would frown, and the spirits would hound you even into death. The oath-breaker's punishment did not end with his body. It stretched into eternity. That was the true genius or cruelty of these rituals. They reached beyond the visible into the invisible, so that even alone, far from your Khan and comrades, you still felt watched. Genghis Khan didn't need guards at every man's back. He let the weight of invisible witnesses do the work. And on the steppe, where the wind never stopped whispering, there was no escaping the feeling that you were never truly alone. Loyalty in the Mongol world was never partial. It was not enough to promise support in battle, nor to stand by a friend in times of hardship. Loyalty demanded everything, down to the marrow of one's bones. The price of brotherhood was total surrender, so total that a man might be called upon to kill those he loved most, if that was what the Khan decreed. It was a chilling calculus. The life of your family weighed against the oath you had sworn beneath the eternal sky. The historical record is clear on one point. Genghis Khan's generals and companions routinely placed loyalty to him above kinship. One famous episode describes his execution of a loyal comrade's brother because that brother had betrayed the Khan. The comrade, though grief-stricken, did not rebel. Instead, he stood silently, understanding that his oath bound him more strongly than family ties. The steppe world was harsh, but Genghis sharpened that harshness into law. Family could be replaced, loyalty could not. The disturbing underside of this truth is rarely spoken aloud. Some chronicles suggest that warriors were sometimes tested by the Khan in ways that would horrify us today. They might be ordered to kill a relative, seize family property, or abandon their kin to starvation, all as a demonstration of their devotion. To falter was to admit that blood ties outweighed the oath, and faltering was death. Imagine standing in that circle of fire, knowing that one day you might be asked to drive your blade into someone who shared your blood, just to prove that your first allegiance was no longer to them, but to the man at the center of the empire. Yet historians disagree on how often such tests were real, and how often they were whispered warnings, designed to frighten men into obedience. Some scholars argue that the Khan had no need to demand such cruelties frequently. The fear of being asked was enough to keep loyalty unbroken. Others point to records of generals carrying out these terrible acts without hesitation, suggesting that the ritual of brotherhood had truly supplanted family bonds. As with so much Mongol history, the line between fact and legend blurs into smoke. Now picture yourself as one of those warriors. You share blood with your Khan, scars with your comrades, and yet your mother's face lingers in memory, your brother's laugh haunts the silence. If the Khan commanded their deaths, what would you do? To refuse is to meet the punishment of an oath breaker, buried in shame and suffocation. To obey is to carve your own soul in half. It is a choice so cruel it almost feels designed not to be a choice at all. And still, irony crept into even this nightmare. Mongol warriors, grim-faced killers on the battlefield, would sometimes joke that being ordered to slaughter kin was the only time they truly feared their Khan. Better 10 arrows in the chest than one command like that, they'd mutter. Some would even laugh bitterly that marrying into another clan was more dangerous than fighting it, because kinship bonds had a way of becoming targets under the Khan's iron law. This is why the Mongols' brotherhood was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. It was not loyalty as we understand it. It was a loyalty that devoured everything else, consuming family, love, and self in the service of empire. The bowl of blood you had once drunk from, the scar that burned on your flesh, the fire and the spirits you had sworn before, all of it came crashing down on you the moment loyalty was tested. And there was no escape, no compromise, no mercy. The price of brotherhood was everything. And once you had paid, there was nothing left to give. Night fell heavy on the Mongol camps, the steppes swallowed by silence except for the restless whinny of horses and the hiss of dying fires. It was in these hours, when laughter softened, when armor lay piled beside sleeping mats, that the truth leaked out in whispers. Loyalty might have been sealed with scars and blood, but not every heart was steady. Some men, huddled beneath furs, confessed to each other that the oaths frightened them more than enemy blades. The historical fact is simple. The Mongols were not a monolith of unquestioning obedience. Even among Genghis Khan's loyal horde, there were deserters, defectors, and skeptics. Persian chroniclers noted cases where warriors fled before great battles, abandoning their blood bonds in hopes of saving themselves. Such betrayals were rare, but their existence proves that fear, however strong, was not absolute. Some men weighed the taste of blood in their mouths against the taste of freedom and chose the latter, though they knew the risk. But the disturbing details of these late-night murmurs show us another side. Some accounts describe men who drank from the oath bowl yet never fully trusted it, whispering afterward that they felt cursed. Others confessed that they dreamt of spirits dragging them away, the voices of ancestors scolding them for binding themselves to a mortal man. One story tells of a warrior who cut his palm for the ritual, but later, in secret, pressed herbs into the wound as if trying to heal away the bond. He was discovered, and though he was not executed, he was mocked for the rest of his days, called the half-brother, a reminder that his loyalty had been doubted. Historians still argue whether these tales are literal truths or exaggerations crafted to add color to Mongol lore. Were men truly that afraid of the oaths, or were these stories created later to humanize the unstoppable Mongol war machine? Some scholars suggest that the very existence of whispered doubt proves the ritual's effectiveness. If no one feared them, no one would have bothered whispering. Others argue that these stories may have been enemy propaganda, designed to puncture the image of Mongol unity. The debate, like those campfire murmurs, lingers in the dark. Imagine lying there yourself, curled against the cold, your comrades breathing heavy around you. You remember the sting of the cut, the sour taste of milk and blood on your tongue. Your hand throbs where the scar has begun to form. You tell yourself the oath is unbreakable, yet your stomach twists. What if you falter? What if, one day, you find the Khan's command unbearable? Would you betray the oath, or would you betray yourself? The silence becomes suffocating and you close your eyes, pretending sleep will chase the thoughts away. Even here, the Mongol instinct for irony surfaced. Around the fires, men joked that the spirits must get bored watching so many oaths, or that the ancestors would prefer wine to blood if only they had the choice. One tale describes a warrior laughing that he'd drink his oath again if it came in a proper cup, instead of a chipped bowl. The laughter spread, thin and nervous, because they all knew the truth. No amount of jokes could erase the weight of the rituals. And so, the dark camps became places of both loyalty and unease. By day, men rode together like a single organism, bound by oath and blood. By night, they whispered doubts into the wind, voices carried away across the steppe. Perhaps those whispers reached the ears of the eternal sky. Or perhaps they dissolved into nothing, like smoke vanishing above a dying fire. Either way, they remind us that even the fiercest brotherhoods have cracks that flicker most clearly in the dark. By now, the rituals of blood and fire had become more than private ceremonies whispered in the night. They hardened into the very machinery of empire. What began as brotherhood among boys and comrades transformed into political contracts, the kind that could move tribes, topple rulers, and bind entire nations under one man's command. Genghis Khan understood that the same blood which once tied two men together could also tie thousands into a web of obligation that stretched across the steppe and beyond. The historical fact is unavoidable. Genghis Khan reorganized the Mongol world not by kinship but by loyalty. He broke the old tribal aristocracy and instead built a system in which positions of power were given to those who swore, and proved, their devotion. Commanders were elevated not because of their birth, but because of their oath. Subutai, the legendary general who led campaigns from China to Hungary, began life as the son of a humble herdsman. Yet his blood bond with the Khan lifted him to heights that noble lineage alone could never have achieved. In this way, the ritual of loyalty became state policy. But woven into this system were disturbing details. The same oaths that promoted men also turned them into hostages of their own vows. Once a man swore, he could not withdraw without branding himself traitor. There are accounts of generals who grew weary of endless conquest, but who dared not leave service because they had drunk from the bowl. To leave was not retirement, it was suicide. Loyalty became law and law became prison. Historians still debate whether these loyalty pacts were universally binding contracts or selectively used tools. Some argue that the Khan invoked oaths primarily when he feared betrayal, while others insist the empire's cohesion proves that the system was uniform. Was every Mongol general truly bound by blood at all times, or did they simply act as though they were terrified by the shadow of the oath? Scholars cannot settle the matter because the records blur between fear and fact. Now picture the politics of it. Tribal leaders summoned to the Khan's tent were not just asked to agree to alliances, they were invited to bleed for them. A treaty with another tribe might be sealed by mixing blood from both sides, poured into wine or milk and drunk as one. Refusal was tantamount to war. Imagine sitting across from the fearsome figure of Genghis Khan, the bowl between you, your heart hammering as you realized the contract was about to be carved not on paper, but on your skin. You either bled with him, or bled against him. Irony, of course, found its way here too. Some storytellers note that the Mongols joked about paper contracts being for weak kingdoms, while theirs were written in ink no one could erase. Others claimed, with grim laughter, that if blood were the true ink of politics, then the steppe had been one long parchment soaked for centuries. Such jokes were bitter, but they carried truth. Their empire was indeed written in veins and scars. Through these political oaths, loyalty rituals became more than superstition. They became legal frameworks. In a world without codified law, blood was the constitution and scars were the signatures. And so, alliances held, armies marched, and nations fell. What began as a childhood game of brotherhood had evolved into the governance of the largest land empire the world had ever known. And yet, beneath the grandeur, every man knew the danger. If loyalty was law, then betrayal was treason of the highest order. Punishments for defectors were not just executions but lessons. Public, spectacular, unforgettable. A single broken oath could ripple across the empire, shaking foundations. Which is why the Khan ensured that no one ever forgot. Loyalty was not just a promise, it was survival. The steppe wind carried many things: dust, smoke, and rumor. But most of all, it carried the whisper that Genghis Khan had transformed loyalty from ritual into rule, and blood into the binding fabric of an empire. The blood oaths of the Mongols are usually told through the voices of men, warriors around fires, generals swearing themselves to the Khan, tribes sealing alliances with scars. Yet in the shadows of these rituals moved women, often unspoken in chronicles, but present all the same. Their roles were subtle, sometimes hidden, but no less crucial. For in a society where every oath demanded more than words, the women of the steppe often acted as guardians, enforcers, and even witnesses to loyalty. Here is the historical fact. Mongol women wielded far more influence than their sedentary counterparts in neighboring kingdoms. They managed households, negotiated marriages, and sometimes even commanded troops in their husband's absence. Genghis Khan's mother, Holon, held the fractured family together after his father's death, and his most trusted wife, Borte, played a pivotal role in binding rival clans to his cause. These women did not stand apart from loyalty rituals, they were often the hidden architects behind them. But disturbing details cling to their presence. Some accounts describe women being drawn into oaths not with blades but with milk. While men cut their flesh, women were said to pour bowls of kumis, mixing it with blood or ash and handing it to oath-takers. In this way they became the mediators of ritual, forcing men to drink what they had prepared. Other whispers tell of women whose loyalty was demanded in darker ways. Marriages arranged not for love but for alliance, bodies offered as tokens of peace between tribes. A bride could become a living oath, her very existence a bond that could not easily be broken. Refusing such an arrangement was as dangerous as refusing the blood bowl. Historians are still divided on just how much agency Mongol women wielded in these rituals. Some argue they were little more than pawns, their roles symbolic at best. Others point to repeated examples of powerful women, Holon, Borte, and later Torjin Khatan, who shaped politics and oaths behind the scenes, suggesting their influence was far greater than the chronicles admit. Were women quiet victims or silent power brokers? The truth remains clouded by patriarchal lenses. Picture a ritual in the Khan's camp. The men gather around fire and bowl, cutting their flesh, their blood dripping into the vessel. And at the edge, women move quietly, bringing milk, tending fire, watching with sharp eyes. You drink from the bowl, and it is a woman's hand that steadies it, ensuring you swallow every drop. Later, when doubt gnaws at you, it may be your wife or mother who reminds you, softly, dangerously, that the oath you swore cannot be broken. The loyalty of women, though silent, reinforces the chains of men. An irony is always seeped through. Men would joke grimly that women remembered oaths better than warriors themselves, reminding husbands of promises they'd rather forget. Some quipped that betrayal was impossible not because of the Khan's punishments, but because their wives would kill them first. In the laughter was truth. Domestic bonds often reinforced the blood bonds of empire. Women also became the unrecorded witnesses of these oaths. The spirits of ancestors were invoked, the eternal sky was called upon, but living witnesses were needed too. And who better than those who saw everything in the camp, who managed food, fire, and children while men bled for empire? Their silence was another kind of bond. To betray the oath meant not only betraying the Khan but betraying the watchful eyes of women who carried memory like a second skin. Thus, while their names are fewer in the chronicles, the presence of women in loyalty rituals was undeniable. They were the hands that poured the milk, the voices that whispered warnings, the bodies offered as living treaties. In a world where men cut their flesh for loyalty, women often became the invisible thread that stitched the ritual together. So next time you picture a Mongol blood oath, don't see only scarred hands and dripping bowls. Look into the shadows and you'll find women there too, quiet, unyielding, and every bit as binding as blood. Death did not end the Mongol obsession with loyalty. If anything, it deepened it. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, the empire he left behind was vast, fragile, and hungry for cohesion. His sons and generals inherited not just land and armies, but the oaths that had bound them to him in life. Now those oaths had to be reforged in his absence, transformed from loyalty to a man into loyalty to a dynasty. Death was no escape from blood. It only tightened the bonds. One historical fact is unshakable. Genghis Khan's death was shrouded in secrecy. His burial place remains unknown, concealed by loyal followers who ensured no one could disturb it. Chronicles describe how soldiers killed anyone who stumbled upon the funeral procession, ensuring silence. This secrecy itself was a kind of oath, a final loyalty sworn in the shadow of death. Those who carried his body to its resting place became part of the greatest blood pact of all, an oath never to reveal the grave. And that oath has held for 8 centuries. But disturbing details ripple through the accounts. Some sources hint that at his death, warriors were required to renew their loyalty by swearing over his corpse, mingling their blood with ritual offerings to bind themselves to his successors. Others whisper of horses sacrificed and blood poured onto the earth, sealing his grave with violence and loyalty alike. Imagine kneeling beside the lifeless body of the man you had followed across continents, blade in hand, cutting yourself once more to promise obedience not just to him, but to the empire that would rise from his absence. The air thick with blood and smoke, the silence broken only by the snorts of horses waiting to be slaughtered. Historians disagree about these rituals at the time of his death. Some argue that the secrecy of his burial left no space for such ceremonies, that oaths must have been sworn later at the Kurultai, the great assembly where his heirs were chosen. Others believe the very act of secrecy was ritual enough, that the silence surrounding his grave was the ultimate oath, one so sacred that it silenced generations. Still, the stories of blood oaths at his death persist, haunting the historical record like the ghost of the Khan himself. Picture it. The great conqueror lies still, his skin pale beneath the eternal blue sky he had claimed as his mandate. His generals, scarred and weary, kneel around him. Some cut themselves anew, dripping blood onto the earth where his body rests, whispering promises that they will continue what he began. Others turn their faces upward, murmuring to the sky god, swearing that even in death, their Khan commands them. The grave is filled not only with a body but with vows that cannot decay. Irony crept into this moment too, bitter as the wind. Some later storytellers joked that the Khan's grave was hidden not because of enemies, but because if the location were known, oath breakers would be dragged there and forced to swear again. Others claimed, with dark laughter, that even the earth itself had taken an oath to keep his secret. These jokes masked unease, for the silence around his death was louder than any battle cry. The death oath of Genghis Khan ensured that his empire did not splinter at the first touch of mortality. His sons, his generals, his people, they were bound not only to him, but to the memory of him, sealed by blood, fear, and the eternal mystery of his grave. Death was supposed to loosen bonds. Instead, under the Mongols, it made them eternal. And so the oaths continued, sharper than ever, echoing from a dead man's silence across the vastness of the steppe. Even in death, Genghis Khan held them still. Centuries later, historians still sift through the ashes of Mongol memory, trying to decide whether the blood oaths were as widespread, grotesque, and binding as the legends suggest. The empire left behind more scars than scrolls, and the fragments that remain are riddled with contradictions. What was sacred ritual to one chronicler appears as barbaric propaganda to another. And so, the true shape of these oaths lies somewhere between history and myth, blurry, unsettling, unresolved. The historical fact is this: loyalty rituals of some kind did exist among the Mongols. Sources like The Secret History of the Mongols, Rashid al-Din's Chronicles, and Chinese accounts all agree that blood, kinship, and ritual were essential to Genghis Khan's rise. No empire of that size and speed could have formed without an iron grip on loyalty. The oaths were not fables, they were part of the engine that forged conquest. Yet disturbing uncertainties swarm like vultures around the details. Did every warrior truly drink from a communal bowl of blood, or was this reserved for elite bonds? Were bones and ashes actually consumed, or did symbolism become twisted into horror by later retellings? Was the loyalty of women in these ceremonies powerful or powerless? Did men truly slaughter family members at the Khan's command, or were such tales exaggerated to emphasize the terror of his reign? The records rarely agree. Historians today remain divided. Some argue that foreign chroniclers, particularly those in Persia and China, had reason to depict the Mongols as savage, turning symbolic rituals into gruesome theater. Others insist that the persistence of these stories across multiple sources suggests they were not entirely inventions. After all, the Mongols thrived on reputation. Fear itself was a weapon. Perhaps they allowed the rituals to be seen or distorted, knowing their enemies would spread the stories. What better way to terrify a rival than to convince him your men drank blood and mocked family ties? Picture the debate. In a quiet library, a historian insists that the bowl of blood was metaphor, nothing more than a poetic phrase for unity. Across the room, another scholar slams a dusty volume shut and insists it was literal, recalling accounts of oath-breakers punished with suffocating soil. Meanwhile, the truth lingers like the smoke of an old fire, impossible to grasp. Perhaps the rituals were both, sometimes symbolic, sometimes savage, always adaptable to circumstance. Even here, irony creeps in. Historians joke that Genghis Khan would laugh at their endless debates, pleased that his legend still unsettles centuries later. Some quip that the only oath modern scholars could agree on is to never fully agree on the Mongols. The laughter is nervous, though, because the shadow of those rituals still feels heavy. If the uncertainty itself is frightening, perhaps that is exactly how the Mongols intended it. The ambiguity has power. A clean, documented truth might fade with time, but a half-seen ritual, whispered in contradiction, endures. The Mongols may be gone, but their oaths remain alive in the very confusion they left behind, terrifying not because we know them fully but because we do not. And so the question lingers: were Genghis Khan's blood oaths truly horrific, or were they legends sharpened into weapons of fear? Historians argue the steppe keeps its silence, and the truth remains buried like the Khan himself, hidden, guarded, and echoing across the centuries. The winds of the steppe still carry echoes, though the riders are gone. Where once firelight flickered on bowls of blood and blades cutting flesh, only silence now lingers. Yet in that silence lies unease, because the memory of the Mongol oaths has never truly faded. The empire collapsed, the dynasty fractured, but the stories of loyalty carved in skin and bound in blood linger like scars across history. One historical fact is clear: the Mongol Empire, though short-lived in comparison to Rome or China, left behind an indelible mark. At its peak, it stretched from the shores of Korea to the plains of Hungary, its power fueled not just by armies but by the strange glue of loyalty rituals that terrified friend and foe alike. Without that web of oaths, the tribes would never have united, the generals never obeyed, the conquests never succeeded. Blood oaths were not decoration. They were the skeleton beneath the empire's flesh. Yet the disturbing truth is that these oaths did not vanish with the empire's fall. In Central Asia, echoes of them persisted in folk rituals, in whispered stories of loyalty sealed with blood or fire. Some traditions of shared bowls and scarred palms lingered for centuries, diluted but still recognizably born from the same dark soil. Even today, traces of such practices survive in cultural memory, proof that scars can outlast empires. And historians still wrestle with uncertainty. Were these echoes authentic survivals of Mongol ritual, or were they reinventions, legends carried forward because they were too powerful to forget? Some scholars claim the later stories are embellishments, shadows of shadows. Others argue that the persistence of blood pacts across Eurasia suggests the Mongol legacy never truly ended. Once again, the debate circles endlessly as if the oaths themselves refuse to let go. Now picture yourself standing on the steppe today. The grass sways, the horizon stretches forever, and the sky above remains the same eternal blue. You close your eyes and in the hush, imagine the circle of men, the sting of steel, the warmth of blood mingled in a bowl. You hear the chants, the laughter, the silence heavy with unseen witnesses. You taste iron on your tongue though your lips are dry. For a moment, you are one of them, and the oath whispers across centuries. Loyalty demanded, loyalty devoured. Irony still follows the memory. Tour guides laugh that even now, no one dares joke too loudly near Genghis Khan's monuments, in case the spirits are still listening. Locals mutter with half smiles that the Khan keeps his oaths better than his descendants ever did. The humor is thin but necessary, because beneath it lies the unspoken dread that maybe, just maybe, those oaths have not finished binding. And so the story closes not with triumph, but with unease. The Mongols are gone, yet the thought of them cutting flesh, drinking blood, swearing before sky and spirit, still chills the imagination. History records many empires, but few leave behind rituals that feel alive long after the empire itself is dust. These oaths do. They are echoes of blood in the steppe wind, unseen, unheard, yet impossible to forget. The fire has burned to embers now. The voices are gone, the horses silent, the banners long fallen. Only the steppe remains, endless and indifferent, its grasses whispering secrets to the eternal blue sky. Yet if you stand still long enough, you might almost hear it, the faint echo of chants, the clink of a blade, the soft hiss of blood meeting dust. The rituals are gone, but their shadow lingers, like a stain the wind cannot erase. There is something haunting about loyalty purchased with blood. It feels permanent, heavier than words, and yet fragile in its own way. For all the power those oaths gave Genghis Khan, his empire splintered within a century of his death. Blood could bind men for a time but not forever. The scars remained, yes, but the empire those scars built slipped back into the soil. And still the imagery lingers, unsettling and magnetic. To drink from a bowl of blood, to feel eyes both seen and unseen pressing down on you, to laugh nervously while swallowing fear, these things are not easily forgotten. They cling to memory like smoke, twisting through generations, retold in whispers and shudders. Perhaps that is their truest legacy, not the empire of land but the empire of fear, imagination, and story. The wind across the steppe tonight carries nothing of empire, nothing of Khan, nothing of blood. But it does carry silence, the kind that follows after something too great, too terrible, to ever be repeated. And in that silence, you are left with a question that has no answer. If called to the circle, if handed the bowl, would you drink?